lot of them were Wobblies in Bisbee. I'm talking about and James was talking about labor history a little bit. International Workers of the World was known as the Wobblies, a very progressive union. The first governor, Governor Hunt, was progressive and supported the Wobbly strike in Bisbee. But before that happened, the state set up its constitution. And as part of the progressive era, several states that became states later on, not the ones that became states back in the 18th century, but the ones that became states in the 20th century, put in their constitution democracy. Not representative democracy, but democracy. I'm talking about initiative, referendum, and recall. We have rights, and other states, many states, most states don't have that right. So I've been fortunate to be able to use the Constitution to work for my goals. But I'm going to back up a little bit before that, before I came to Arizona, which was back in 1972. I came to Arizona. In '66, I was back in St. Louis at college, attended college from '66 to '70. And as I mentioned, I worked to try to stop the war in Vietnam. But it wasn't a few people who stopped it. It was mostly people in Vietnam who stopped the war. Their resistance stopped the war because the war could not be won. If the people in Vietnam did not stand up for their country, they would have been defeated. But later on, in 1968, 1969, when President Nixon wanted to expand the bombing of the North, he was told by J. Edgar Hoover, "I cannot guarantee the civil tranquility of this country if you do that." And he did not. He backed off because the population, not one person, not two people, but Hoover knew that the mass of people he couldn't control the country. As it was, May 4th, 1970, the colleges around the country, maybe you know, were basically closed down at that time. It was something like 50 ROTC buildings were burned that day. Now, I was not accused of burning any building, although my wanted poster said I was armed and dangerous, which I was never involved in anything like that. But let's get back to that 1969. I just want to mention that there was a disinvestment campaign against apartheid in South Africa. And you may think, well, that was 1980s, wasn't it? At our campus in 1969, working with the Black Student Union, we were one of the first groups that disrupted the board meeting demanding disinvestment in South Africa. That's 1969. That's 15 years before it became a national campaign. And I checked a couple of days ago, and Wikipedia says the campaign in the United States started in 1977. So obviously my political activities were a little constrained after 1972 until I just couldn't resist anymore. I just had to been involved with community activities and was working working on environmental issues and corporate welfare issues. Helped publish a monthly alternative left publication called The Current. Got involved in various activities, anti-nuclear activities. Didn't really want to show my face or get my name out there initially when I was in Arizona in 1972, living as Gary Treadaway. But then living in Scottsdale in 1996, the hockey team, the Coyotes, wanted a public subsidy of $300 million to build an arena in Scottsdale. And that was approved. But the public had a referendum and we defeated that $300 million subsidy. Then 2 years later, working with some friends, we wrote and passed Arizona's Clean Elections Initiative, which was gutted by the Supreme Court. They say money is speech and corporations are people. But we were successful, and anybody who's working, I know my ex-Janet here, and Janet, can you stand up please? She's working on an initiative to give the women the right to choose, and hopefully everybody here will support that. We're lucky to live in a state where women will have the right to choose after November.
Yes.
And I just want to quickly say something I'm working on now related to my lawsuit against the state of Arizona, which many of you are familiar with. It's Ralph still here, he's my co-plaintiff. I'm the lead plaintiff on this case. The Constitution has two provisions. One is called the gift clause. The state cannot give away gifts. Last year, the Republicans were giving gifts away. They gave $15.3 million to the rodeo, and I sued the state. There's another provision in the Constitution that says there must be separate bills for separate subjects, and this appropriation was thrown in with 100 appropriations. So we sued on that basis also. So I want to let you know that we're lucky to have the Constitution we have, and we need to work to expand citizen participation. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go into the second group question, and anyone who feels to jump in, but remember that there are other people up here who might want to talk. The group question is, what advice do you have for social justice advocates? What advice do you have for social justice advocates?
How many minutes on that one?
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Two.
You want to go?
I'll go first.
Oh, yeah.
I'll make it
Get your
count.
mic.
Oh. Earlier I mentioned Senator Ken Bennett and the law change, but getting back to the care homes, and then I'll answer the question. I do want to let it be known that Senator Leila Austin and Kristen Sinema, at that time a legislator, both said yes to my question before I even asked it. Over the years, I've written many letters to the editors throughout Arizona and also to many politicians. And I've often been asked, why do you write so many letters? And my answer is to educate, motivate, and sometimes to advocate. I believe we all have a responsibility to speak out against hate and racism and violence. We should not be held hostage by those who choose to promote hate and division. And we should all stand up for the values we represent: equality and equal opportunity, inclusiveness, fairness, and kindness. All of us must speak out and stand up for freedom and democracy, justice, peace, and love. I believe all of this should be the change that we want to have in our world. On a side note, in reviewing my remarks for today's event, I think I have also written my eulogy as well. All of you, thank you for your commitment to civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, gay rights, immigrant rights, voters' rights, and human rights. And I wish you all love and peace.
Sure. Advice that I have as a social justice advocate: election season is here, and everything's really tense and heated. And I just think it's important to recognize, to get in touch with your own emotions, I guess is really the most simple way to say it. And to recognize when your actions are out of fear, or just where they're coming from an emotional standpoint. Where are they out of fear? Are they out of spitefulness? Are they out of a desire to be right, because we're all humans and we all have egos? Or are they really coming from a place of centering those who are most disenfranchised, and trying to get clear with that with yourself? And I think when you can get clear with that, you can move forward in a way that invites people in more than pushes people away. So that'd be my advice.
As far as my advice, I would just say you need to follow your feelings and your emotions, and I don't think you need to copy anybody. Certainly don't copy me. I don't recommend being a fugitive. But I just want to, there's a lot of seniors in our area here and a lot in this room. And just one thing that I have learned about recently is Ralph Nader set up an organization that's geared towards having seniors become active in social issues. So if you're not plugged in, you might contact his organization and get plugged in. But there are a lot of other groups that you can get plugged into, and it's just a matter of putting your toes in the water and getting involved in issues. I know a lot of people here are already involved, and I can't give you advice. You could probably give me some advice too. So I appreciate all the commitment of everybody here on the panel. Very considerable commitment. And my question was about how I was able to help get some legislation. Well, James probably got more legislation than I did for his efforts. But I did pass 2 other initiatives. I helped write and pass 2 local initiatives. I just want to mention those 2 that a lot of people have forgotten about them. One is called the Reasonable Growth Initiative, which is to control annexations, and the other one is a Taxpayer Protection Initiative, which requires a public vote on large projects like the Big Chino project. I just wanted to mention that. And we can all learn from our failures and move on. And one reason that I got involved in local issues rather than Vietnam and national issues, because I could feel the results of my actions. And I felt working locally, I could actually have a victory. And the biggest victory in my life was the passage of the Clean Elections Initiative. And I can really feel that my efforts got some results. So that's why I think it's very beneficial for me to work on local issues, and maybe it'll be for you too. Thank you.
My advice would be just to get involved, make an impact, a positive impact in your community, work with your community partners, work with your allies, work with your state, work with your representatives, know your laws, learn your laws, push for what's right, you know, that everyone have a fair share in life. We all are going through something. And we don't want our children to have to look back and say, what did our generation do? Do what you can. Every little part is valuable. Even if it's just a little voice, be a little voice for those that are in need.
Folks, social justice activism and advocacy is not a hobby. It's not something you do part-time. It's not something to be taken lightly, and it's not something that we do for fun. In many cases, it's a matter of life and death. And so I have 3 things I would like to share as far as pieces of advice go. They have to do with consistency, camaraderie, and creativity. First, with consistency. Showing up with consistency, showing up consistently for the people who you hope to be an ally to really matters. And showing up consistently with lip service doesn't get you there. How you show up consistently really matters. And what that means is you stick with your values and your principles all the way through. You know, there's a lot of compromise. Compromise is something that, you know, politicians have to do and that you have to do in life, but values and principles are not up for compromise. Camaraderie. Find mentors. Find people who you can share the work that you are doing with. As Howard mentioned, nobody can do it alone. Together is how we get it done. Together is where the support systems are. Together is how we increase our numbers to evolve consciousness in the way that we all in this room, I think, believe needs to happen. And so camaraderie creates the connection and it creates the fertile ground for the work to continue. And finally, creativity. I'm an artist. And throughout my work as an activist and as an advocate, I always try to bring a creative element to that, because creativity also is connecting in so many ways. Whether it's visual art, whether it is theater, I do spoken word poetry. There are so many different creative ways to connect and to connect to this work. And an example of that, back in February, the MLK committee had a little event just a block over at the Federal. And part of that event was a person who participated in that event was a man named David Nelson, who was a member of the Last Poets in New York City. They're a slam poetry group that started in the late 60s. And as a part of that event, David called on one of his comrades that he started the Last Poets with. And he's one of the last poets himself. And he said a few lines from a poem. Blessed are those who struggle. Oppression is worse than the grave. Better to live as an, oh my God.
Senior moment. You understand what I'm talking about. Bring what you have in your creative realm to the game and bring it with love. Oppression is worse than the grave. Better to die for a noble cause than to live and die as a slave. Oppression is worse than the grave. Better to live
Better to die for a noble cause than to live and die as a slave, right? This is what we're here for. To empower the people around us. To uplift the people who don't have the same power that we do. Thank you.
Okay, I hope each one of you got a bit or a morsel from these people up here. And I really appreciate them being here. Howard said something that caused me to think back about failure. And I hope you all fail, and fail a lot. Because if you fail a lot, that means you're trying. And so, Marty.
Hi, I'm Marty Nelson. I'm also on the MLK committee. And I happen to have here what Howard was talking about. It's the petition that is, the movement is over at the end of the month. So we only have a few more days to sign. If you haven't signed yet, if you haven't had the opportunity, and if you would like to, this is access to abortion for Arizonans. And that's, I have it here. So please see.
Okay, we're going to move into the Q&A section. That's okay. And I'm going to float around in the audience, and I want you to use the mic so that people who might have hearing difficulties can hear your question. So, do we have a question or a comment?
I got so much out of this, like, it's wonderful. But coming here today, I live in Jerome, I flipped off 3 Trumpers. And driving home, I will not do that.
Thank you for all of your great thoughts. My question is, my fear is with the coming election, and it's obviously apparent that you, all 5 of you, are filled with love in your hearts and also God-fearing. I have a fear of this white Christian nationalism intertwining with our government. And I'm wondering how each of you feels about that, and if that is also part of your activism. Thank you.
Nobody thought fascism would happen in America. And that's what we're facing right now. We're facing Christian nationalism with a view of one individual who is powerful, who is godlike. And that's almost a large portion of our country is there. We just need to fight it. That's just the plain and simple about it. It's happening in Europe, and they're scapegoating immigrants instead of dealing with real issues. We were talking about fear. A couple of people here were talking about fear, and that's what they're based on, is fear.
Okay. I know that what we're facing is very scary, and Howard correctly identified it as fascism. But if we look at American history, this is actually not something that is all that new. And if you look at the movements that have happened in this country, and you look at the powerful, inspiring leaders of those movements, and you look at what they did in the Jim Crow South, and you look at where we are now, we have the power. We are the majority.
Yep. Yes.
And we need to act like it.
Yep.
And what that means in November is that we need to get out the vote, like we never got out the vote before.
Yeah.
That is what the name of the game is for the next 5 months. Believe it. And so I think everybody in this room needs to ask themselves, what am I going to do to ensure that fascism doesn't come to America in a whole new way on our watch?
This isn't really a question, but I think we need to start to be more aware too of how our language is being perverted by those who want to take down our democracy. And it just keeps occurring to me, somehow they've made being against fascism a dirty word. They call it Antifa. That's what Antifa is, against fascism. So if you're against fascism, you're the enemy, and that's perversion of our language. Okay, and it's a kind of propaganda that is seeping into our consciousness, whether we're aware of it or not. So that's my comment.
I have something to just add to that. I think it's interesting that several of our stories around why we got involved in social justice started when I think you said, both you mentioned being 12 years old and you mentioned being a young person, and so I noticed that a lot of the efforts to silence or to change curriculum in schools, actually a lot of those efforts inhibit the ability for young people to foster critical thinking skills. And so I think there's an interesting thread that many of us got interested in social justice work and got used to utilizing our voice when we were 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And if we don't continue to support initiatives that allow young people, even when they can't vote, to build the muscle of using your voice. It is a muscle and you have to practice it. And if we don't start teaching them when they're young, then they will become voters who voluntarily accept fascism or other forms of oppression that silence them. And so while it's not an immediate remedy for November, I noticed at the Launchpad, because we have teens on our board of directors and because we have teens leading programs, and they can't vote yet, but they love using their voice and they love being supported in using their voice, and the more we support them in doing it, the better they get at it. And it's not, I'm not attached to how they use their voice because that's not my role, but I am attached to them learning to use their voice because it is a muscle and they've got to develop it before they're 18.
I wanted to say another thing about language, because that's another battle that we have to fight. These people call themselves Christian nationalists, and they are not in any way, shape, or form Christian, as I understand it, like loving your neighbor, and they are not in any way talking about the nation, like the United States, and what it has always stood for. And so we have to point out the fallacies in just their language.
Yes, and it's not only the language that they're trying to change, it's also the history that they're trying to change.
Yeah.
You know, the history of the anti-war movement and all the other movements before that. So I think that that's another aspect we have to look at and be aware of.
I'm kind of curious, what is your committee doing to support the next generation of leadership for the problems that are ahead of us? We've been talking about current events, but there hasn't been any mention about the environmental issues. Are anyone aware of Health versus Montana past year, and the young people there that overthrew the Constitution of Montana for clean energy?
Courtney's training the next generation. That's not something I'm doing.
Please use your mic so that we can hear you in the back. Anyone else want to address this question?
I have not state is working. I have not actually addressed that or been in that area, but I know that we do need to look towards a cleaner environment as far as gas, fuel, because we see it. We see the evidence of it. A lot of people are not focusing in that area because they don't feel there's a need for that right now. We talk a lot about the climate change and the stuff that's going on around us, but I think the focus is working together as a people. It goes back to being a voice. Get out and vote. Get out and do your part, because things don't change if you don't get out and say anything. If you stay silent, it stays silent. The only way we can get out and really be a voice is to get out to the polls, get out and be vocal, be out, be visual. Let them know that we have rights. We have to let them know we have rights. We all have rights to be free. We all have rights to live in a good human way. We have to voice those rights, whether they like it or not, and support one another in that. And I think that's the key. We haven't came together enough to support in those areas. We have people fighting on this side, people fighting on that side. Prayer is good, but prayer is not always the answer.
And you bring up a point about our group. We have so many issues, and the opposition is always united. So how do we come together? How do we start to pick apart the problems that we're having overcoming? We're in an election where it's only a 2% difference, which is unbelievable for me, because I took an oath to defend my Constitution. I enlisted after the towers came down. And this is absurd to me, to see this come to a point where I had friends die because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And right now, more and more of our problems with our group is that we have so many issues and we don't coalesce quickly enough. We're 4.5 months away from an election that's a coin toss, and that's unbelievable.
I just wanted to comment, because the last two questions, one was about language and one is about the climate catastrophe we're experiencing right now. And I have worked on money in politics, and we have a serious problem here. Money buys a lot in this country. You have a small number of fossil fuel companies who can deny, and pay those think tanks to cover their story. And that's where the language comes in, because the right is, when I'm talking about the right part of politics versus the left. The right controls the debate, and they have for over 20 years, because they have the big money and they have a strategy on how to use the words. You may remember the death tax. And that was an inheritance tax that affects the top 0.5% of the population. And that was structured by the right to be against family farms and against family businesses. And it was a death tax. And they continue to do that, and they're very good at it.